evening, participants. Welcome back to lecture 11 of this 15-day online lecture series on history of ideas. On behalf of Team Dad Voyage and myself and my co-organizer, Dr. Bashudhara Roy, we are extremely happy and honored to welcome the speaker of today, Dr. Amitabu Bhattacharya. Sir, good evening on behalf of Team Dad Voyage. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to have you. Uh, it gives me immense sense of pride and honor to introduce you to the speaker of the day. Dr. Amitabu Bhattacharya did his MSc in physics from IIT Kanpur. He did his PhD on Langmuir monolayers of liquid crystals from Raman Research Institute, Bangalore, after which he went to laboratory, the physics of Solides in Orsay, France for a postdoc, where he studied monolayers of surfactants and polyelectrolytes. He worked here for 2 years, and then he worked on micro encapsulation for a year and a half at Institut Froquet du Petrol. And then he returned in 2003 and joined the St. Joseph's College in Darjeeling as a lecturer in physics. Right now, he is serving as Associate Professor of Physics at Sikkim University, Gangtok. His research interests include soft materials, especially liquid crystals, soaps, and detergents. Apart from academics, he is also interested in quizzing, literature, music, and traveling. He has, to his credit, publications in very reputed and prestigious journals like Chemical Reviews, Langmuir, Physical Chemistry, Chemical Physics, Europhysics, Letters, etc. Sir, on behalf of Team Dad Voyage, we welcome you. So, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and speaking on a topic which is very, very interesting on our part. And we look forward for such an interesting topic as students of literature. We all have heard Einstein, but we look forward how you correlate Einstein and his ideas and literature, because literature also is one of the areas that interest you a lot. So thank you very much for accepting, and we look forward for, I'm sure, dear participants, we are in for a cerebral treat. Uh, Dr. Amitabu Bhattacharya, the platform is all yours, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Banerjee, for the kind words of introduction. And well, as it has already been marked, it is going to be a journey of 66 slides. And so let me start immediately. And yes, one thing is for sure, as you have heard, I am from purely a science background. Literature has been an interest, but that has been an interest in a different way. So, and if any of you are from science, you will realize that Einstein and his ideas on relativity has been far, far away from my research work. I have worked in the fields where the two aspects of modern physics, relativity and quantum mechanics, do not make an appearance at all. The physics that I work on can be explained by using the ideas of Newton and Galileo. We don't have to go anywhere beyond that. But yes, relativity is interesting, and let us go into it. Here we have the topic and the details. The topic is envisioning relativity, Einstein and his ideas. So here we have the Einstein as we mostly know him, explaining E equal to mc square. And here we have the genius in before he was recognized as a genius, when he was just a few years old. Here you can see how important the equation has become, because a Christmas card also comes with mc square equal to E to mean Merry Christmas to everyone. So special relativity, the main ideas I'm using are from this particular book, which is Special Relativity for the Enthusiastic Beginner by David Morin. The details are given here. In addition, these are Had I been teaching a bunch of physicists, I would have used this book, Introduction to Special Relativity by Robert Fiske. But if you want a fun introduction to a roller coaster ride into the world of relativity and quantum mechanics, I fully recommend the second book, The New World of Mr. Tompkins by George Gamow and Russell Stein. If you want it, it's available online. Both if you want to buy it online, it's there. If you want to steal it online, the PDF is also there. Here is another masterpiece on only on E equal to mc squared. This is the biography of the world's most famous equation by David Bodanis. This is a masterstroke of a book, and I would like you, anybody who wants to learn relativity, to read this book. Here are some other books. This is Albert Einstein's own book on relativity. This is, of course, a very new cover and a new edition that I have shared with you. This book is also very interesting, The Dancing Wu Li Masters. This is an overview of new physics by Gary Zukav. Wu Li is the Chinese word for physics. Here, physics has been compared to a dance. All physicists are dancing, and the way we learn it is we join and dance, and we get corrected as we make mistakes. But yes, now is the question. I have been into quizzing, as you have said. Dr. Banerjee has already said. So I would like to ask you, what is common to the color of gold, the liquid state of mercury, the success of lead batteries, the nuclear reactors and the atom bombs, the stability of uranyl ions, and the fact that platinum is such a good catalyst for organic reactions, and that platinum, though a metal, forms negative ions? The answer is, of course, this gentleman, Einstein's theory of relativity. So there are actually two theories of relativity. The special theory of relativity, which was published in 1905, considered to be the wonder year of Albert Einstein and the wonder year of modern physics, and general relativity, which was published later in 1916. Now, for today, and in most of our cases, we do stick to special relativity. In special relativity, we don't include gravity, we don't include acceleration. So everything moves at constant speeds. That is special relativity, which is what we are going to touch today. We will not be going into general relativity at all. So let us start with the old man of physics, Galilei. Okay. So let us say there is a train moving along. Say this is the track, here is the platform, I'm standing here. Here is the train. People are going in the train. So while the train is going, person one claps his hands, person two stomps his feet. Not at the same time, not at the same place. Okay? On the train, both are on the train, not at the same place, not at the same time. So what is the difference between them? The distance between them, if you measure from the train, the distance between them when they did these activities is delta x prime. The time between them is delta t prime. Okay, so they are at a distance of delta x prime, and they did these activities at delta t prime. So these are the space and time separations on the train for a person on the train. I am standing on the platform. So what do I see? What do I see, right? So that is important. And this is what Galileo will give us. So time separation for me on the platform, we'll call it delta t. And it is clear that it should be delta t equal to delta t prime. Clear, I put it in inverted commas for a specific reason. We'll come to that in a big way. So we say that time separation does not change. So delta t equal to delta t prime. Now we have all traveled by train, right? We don't get down at the destination station and check whether our watch is correct or not. So the watch runs in the same way in the train as outside the train. So fine. So we say that delta t is equal to delta t prime, time does not change. And what about the spatial separation, delta x? If the train is not moving, delta x is delta x prime. Right. If the train is standing, then what's the big deal? So the point is every x prime in train is equal to some x on the ground plus a fixed number. Why? Because of the zero. If you put the zero on the ground, your value will be different. If you put the zero on the train, the value will be different. Nothing else. Okay. So now x prime on the train for the person who claps hands is, let us say, x1 prime. For the person who stomps feet is x2 prime. So the difference is delta x prime equal to x2 prime minus x1 on the train. Outside the train, it is x2 minus x1. But see, the train is not moving. So whether I measure from here or I measure from here, whether I measure from here on the train or I measure from here outside the train, the difference, the values would be different, but the difference would be the same. So for a non-moving train, delta x prime is equal to x delta x. Nothing will happen, okay? Nothing changes. But what happens if the train is moving? So when the train is moving, right, with a speed v, we use v for speed because the scientific word used for is not speed but velocity. The difference is not very important right now. It will not bother. So because of that, the ground remains at one place. But the train was here when event 1 occurred. Train is here when event 2 occurred. Okay. So the train has moved. So delta x1. So delta x1 is, it is like this. This is the distance vt prime. So the first event occurred when the train was here. The person clapped hands. By the time the person stomped with the feet, the train had moved from here to here. And this is the distance between them. So person 1 moved from here to here. Person 2 would have moved from here to here. So the position of the clap is here. The position of the stomping is here. So the distance is v delta prime plus delta x. So delta x is equal to delta x prime plus v delta t prime. And we remember that delta t is equal to delta t prime. So these are the good old Galilean transformations done by Galileo Galileo in 1638. So why I put them in color is they are very important. And we will be doing them, we will be coming back to them again. Okay. As things move, things will change, and we will have to come back to it and see whether they make sense or they don't. Now, in 1864, another of those masters from the world of physics, James Clerk Maxwell, who was a physicist, a trained mathematician, amateur poet, and much more. And he was a very close friend of Michael Faraday, though in age they were more like grandfather and grandson. Faraday was much, much older. Though Faraday was an untrained scientist, self-trained, James Clerk Maxwell was a properly trained gentleman scientist of that time. So he wrote down another topic. Electricity and magnetism were two different topics earlier. They were combined by Michael Faraday. James Clerk Maxwell wrote everything known in electricity and magnetism at that time in the form of 4 equations. Okay, in the form of 4 equations, 4 beautiful heat equations. Very neat, very clear, beautiful equations of electricity and magnetism, involving the electric field, the magnetic field, their space derivatives, and the time derivatives. That's it. Now the transform. Now, if you use, now say we write down the equations for a frame in which I am in this room and nothing is moving. You will get a beautiful set of equations. Very nice looking, very standard. Now, you say that no, I want to write the equation for a train which is moving along this route. You will get another set of equations, not the same. Not only the values will change, the equations will change like crazy and they won't be good. So here are the Maxwell's equations just for the record. E is the electric field, H is the magnetic field. This epsilon is the electric constant and mu is the magnetic constants. This rho, zero, this dot and this cross are things you don't have to worry about. No. But here there is another interesting thing I would like to say is this J. This J is not basically needed. Maxwell has put it by hand. And it is because of this J that later on these equations became very, very powerful. So here is the point. As he pondered the long futile fight to make Galileo's world right to in a new variation of the old transformation, it was Einstein who first saw the light. Because you see, if I change things according to the Galilean transformations, Maxwell's equations are not fitting. Maxwell's equations are not fitting. Why are they not fitting? That is important. What is wrong? Are the Galilean transformations wrong? Are the Maxwell's equations wrong? Are both wrong? Or there is something else that is wrong? We don't know that as yet. We will come to that as we move. So here are a couple of conundrums which came up at that time. They did not come up in Maxwell's early days. They came up in Maxwell's later days. So the conundrum says light is an electromagnetic wave. Here is another contribution of Maxwell, which is not very relevant to us. I'll tell you. He showed that light is also electromagnetic. So electricity, magnetism, and light became one field. So the electromagnetic wave moves with a certain speed. That is 3 into 10 to the power 8 meter per second. So you put 3, put 8 zeros. Okay. You write 3, you put 8 zeros. So it goes that many meters in 1 second. That's not right. The correct value is this much. 299,792,458 meters per second. In fact, it is known to a few decimal places also. A lot of experimental work has been done. Now, those days, one could not imagine a wave moving without a medium. You need a medium for a wave to move. Now, light is coming from the sun to the earth. What is the medium there? It was known even then that there is no atmosphere beyond a certain height of the earth. So, they wanted a medium, so they made a medium. That was called ether. Ether is, I believe, the Greek word for sky. So this is one of the 5 elements, or in India, what we would call Panchatattva. This is one of them. Ether was given the name. It had some fantastic properties which I'll not go into. Now this ether theory had a problem. The problem is like this. There is this ether everywhere, right? It's there everywhere. It's there in the air, it's there outside the air, it's there inside the earth, it's there everywhere. And light is passing through that. Now, the earth is moving. So is the ether moving with it, or is the ether not moving? If the ether is not moving, fine. If the ether is moving, then is it moving at the same speed as the earth? Is it being dragged at the same speed, or is it being dragged partially? Those were the ideas. So George Stokes proposed total ether drag in 1845, whereas Fresnel and Young proposed partial ether drag in 1818. So there's a possibility it's fully right. There's a possibility it is only partially. So to find this, here's the first Albert. Okay, Albert 1 of relativity is coming in here. Albert Abraham Michelson and Edward Morley did an experiment. They started the experiment. Michelson on his own started the experiment in 1880, and the experiment was finally finished in the 1890s. It was a long experiment and a very, very carefully done experiment. Let me briefly explain the experiment. Here is a source of light. Here is a slit, which allows a thin line of light to pass. Here you have a mirror, which is called half-silvered mirror. Nowadays, the modern language would be beam splitter. So it is half-silvered mirror. So half the beam goes through, half is reflected, half is transmitted. Half goes through, half is sent back. So the transmitted beam goes this side, gets reflected by this mirror, comes back here and comes here. The reflected beam goes this way and comes back this way. Now, there is a source, there is light coming from this side, there is light coming from this side. These two lights combine here. Now it is obvious that they need not have traveled the same distance because I can move these mirrors. Ideally, one mirror can be bent and one mirror can be moved. That's how it is done. So once that is done, when you see through the microscope, you see lines like this. This is the lines you see with white light. Your light that is coming is not single colored light, it is white light. Because the advantage with white light is the center can be identified by a white light. And if you see, the distance between the lines is equal. So if you had used a colored light, one single wavelength, you will not be able to find out where is the center. So this is the experiment that was to be done. Now, their idea was to find out the difference between the speed of light in this direction and the speed of light in this direction. Okay. The speed may be same, may not be same. That was the idea. Because since the earth is rotating, moving from the west to the east at a speed of what we know now is 31 kilometer per second near the equator. To go away from the equator, it becomes slightly less. At the pole, it is very low. So in Calcutta, we can safely take it as 30 kilometer per second. Okay? Won't be much less than that. So the earth is, let us say, moving this way at a speed of 30 kilometer per second. But there is no movement in this way. So when I am taking this, the time taken for the light to come from here to here and back would be the speed of light minus v in this direction, speed of light plus v in this direction. Okay, so the time taken would be slightly different than had it been see this way and see this way. After doing the experiment within one condition, they rotated the whole thing. They took the whole experiment with this and they rotated it 90 degrees. Not so easy. It was a huge experiment. It must have taken them at least good number of people to physically rotate it. I'll show you a little bit of this. When you rotate it, now this is moving at the old earlier this was moving at old speed of light. This was moving at a different speed. When rotated, this started moving in the constant speed. This started moving in a different speed. Here you can see it. This is when you rotate the machine. So this is like this. Earth is moving through the ether. Ether is fixed. The ether is fixed and the earth is moving. The spring earth is here, all earth is here. Okay, so this is the sun and this is some direction, let us say. So if ether is fixed, then there is a wind here. Ether, as for us on earth, ether is moving backwards. So this was the experimental setup. It was set up on this huge block of granite, which is floating on a tub of mercury. Okay. So here how the calculations are done. I don't think I will go into the details of the calculation. If I take a course on relativity or my physics students, we do the whole calculation. And you expect the results that are expected is, I'll tell you here, what was expected according to their calculation is these lines should have moved to one side by half the distance between two lines, which means, see, this is the width of the two lines from here to here. It should have moved half of this roughly. These are the calculations. I will not go into that. And depending on different situations, theoretically they expected a movement like this. Okay, like this nice dotted curves. What they found is this straight line, the hard curves. Okay, and these hard curves have been exaggerated almost 10 times compared to the soft curves. Okay, so if that is the case, there is hardly any movement. There is hardly any movement, so the lines have not moved. Lines have not moved, which means this is a negative result. The result was negative result. This was what you would call a failure of the experiment. So experiments on the relative motion of the earth and ether, the result is decidedly negative. The deviation of fringes should have been 0.4. And they were able to measure up to 0.01. So 1/40th of what was expected, and they did not get it. The maximum they got was 0.02. So when you expect zero point 0.4 and you get 0.02, you are not. It doesn't, it means that your idea is wrong. So if the ether does slip past here, the relative velocity is less than 1/6. What does it mean? It's not very clear. So the findings of Michelson-Morley show us to say very surely, if this ether is real, then it has no appeal and shows itself off rather poorly. Here is our Albert Abraham Michelson, and here is our Edward Williams Morley. They are almost contemporaries. Morley is slightly older than, Morley is slightly younger than Michelson, and they were opposite to each other in every possible way. He was a Jew. Albert Abraham Michelson was a Jew who did not believe, who was not a believer at all. He was always perfectly well dressed, well spoken, etc. Edward Williams Morley was a devout Catholic, and he was always very sloppily dressed. He would come for his classes, he would take his classes, but he was considered to be the typical, the archetype absent-minded professor. Believe, but then that idea was not there at that. So what do we get? The ether is not dragged with the earth. Let's just take it back. Just take with us this one line. The ether is not dragged with us, with the earth. Earth is not dragging the ether. Now let us look at another experiment. This stellar aberration. Stellar aberration, it produces an apparent motion of celestial objects about their true position. When I'm watching a star, it's like this. If I put up a camera and take a photo of the sun at a specific time every day for a whole year, I see a nice pattern in which the sun is moving. Same thing is true for any star. You have to choose a time and take a photo of that star. And the star seems to be moving in a circle. Okay, the circle, if you take that circle down to your telescope, you get a cone. And that angle of the cone is known. That is more or less fixed over the year. This was very well known. This is like this. If the rain is falling vertically, as you can see here, and you are standing with an umbrella, you have to point your umbrella straight. If you decide to run, it would appear as if the rain is coming in at an angle, and you will have to hold the umbrella back. Same thing happens here. If the earth is stationary and the star is over here, you have to point that telescope exactly towards it. But since the earth is moving, so you have to point your telescope slightly differently. Slightly differently. Okay, you have to. It seems to come not from here, but from a little further there. You are coming. If I'm here, here is my star, but I will feel that the star is here. This angle is not much. It is 20 arc seconds. 1 minute is 1/60th of a degree, and 1 second is 1/60th of a minute. So this is 1 by 180 of a degree. It's a very small amount. So this is like this. If this is my angle theta, which is the actual place where the star should be found if the earth was not moving, and this is the moving frame, the star where it appears. If the angles are theta and phi, then we get this angle. Tan theta by V by C cos theta. Okay. So phi is the apparent angle and theta is equal to the true angle. Then tan phi can be measured like this. So now what happens? This seems to show, this is Thomas Young's work. Upon consideration of the phenomena of the aberration of stars, I am disposed to believe that ether pervades all material bodies with little or no resistance, as freely perhaps as the wind passes through a grove of trees. This means there is no drag. Now, both of these things cannot be true. The ether cannot decide to drag when you are doing the Michelson-Morley experiment and decide not to drag when you are doing the stellar experiment. So something is wrong. Either this is wrong or that is wrong, or our entire thinking process is wrong. It turned out to be the front. So this is the conundrum which I was trying to bring in. Is the ether dragged by the earth or is it not dragged? Lorentz ether theory, Lorentz now comes in the picture. He prepared a theory, developed a theory between 1892 and 1906. He strictly separated matter, that is electrons, and ether. Ether is completely motionless and it has no matter. It's absolutely weightless. So at that time, the way people thought that the rest frame of ether, where ether is not moving, that was compared with the absolute space of Isaac Newton. So there was no other way of thinking. Logically, not necessary, but that was most natural. Here is our man, Hendrik Antoon. I think it should be Antoon. Hendrik Antoon Lorentz. It can be described by electric field and magnetic field. So, so the fundamental concept was theorem of corresponding states, and it was true for terms of the order of v by c. V is the velocity of the body, c is the velocity of light. This is one more thing. I have not used the symbol yet, but whenever I use c, c is always the speed of light. This is apparently the Latin word celeritas, which means speed. So this theorem states that a moving observer with respect to the ether can use the same electrodynamic equation as an observer in the stationary ether. So if you are at rest with the ether or if you are moving with respect to ether, electrodynamic equations will remain the same. That means electricity and magnetism will behave identically. Now, this was not so well appreciated by Lorentz as was appreciated by Poincaré, Jules Henri Poincaré. He was called the last universalist of mathematics because he was a master of all fields of mathematics as it was known at this time. And he has said many things. But now let us look at, let's forget that and let us get into the topic. A big challenge for this theory was Michelson-Morley experiment because it is saying that ether is not moving and the motion relative to the immobile ether should not be should be possible to measure, but we were not able to measure. So Michelson's experiment confirmed total ether drag hypothesis, whereas stellar aberration went against it. So here comes something interesting. Here comes the first, what do you say, the first puff of an idea. Lorentz in 1892 suggested that molecular forces, something happens to the forces between molecules in such a way that the dimension along line of motion comes down. That means if this pencil is moving in this direction, the pencil becomes slightly shorter. If, if you are on the pencil, it will look the same length, but if I'm watching from outside, the moving pencil will become shorter. How much shorter? 1 minus v square by c square under v. Now, v is the velocity of the pencil, c is the velocity of light. We already saw this velocity of light has 8 zeros meters per second. So if I move it this way, as even as a bullet, it will go much less than that. So this v by c will be very small. So this change would be not visible. Why will the moving observer not see? Because his scale will also reduce. So he will measure the same. Lorentz gave 3 possible explanations for this relative contraction. Let's pass them over, but this is the length contraction. L is equal to L0, 1 minus v square by c square. Let us keep this in the back of the mind and we'll bring it back later. Now comes the time business. Length business is done, time business has to be handled. Local time. He defined something called local time where t prime is equal to t minus vx by c square. Again, if you see, v is coming once and c is coming as a power of 2. So this quantity is very small unless your v is very large. So this will again be seen only at very high velocity. T is the time for measured by the fellow who is moving with this, who is at rest in ether, and t prime is the time measured by the observer who is moving. So using this, Lorentz explains Stellar aberration, Doppler effect, and Fizeau experiment. Fizeau experiment will come to this, will not come to them at the moment. But he thought that time transformation, this local time business, is a mathematical game we are playing. It's something fictive. But it was Poincaré who said that this is the most ingenious idea of Lorentz. So this is like this. In 1904, Poincaré demonstrated this. A sends signal at time 0 to B. So B will get it at time TA because the signal will take time to go. B sends signal to A at time 0 to A. It comes at time TB. If TA is equal to TB, both measure the same value, the clocks are synchronous. Okay, this is possible only if the system is such that the clocks are at rest in ether. So, Poincaré decided that local time is a physical effect, like length function. It's something which really happens. And for an observer who is not at rest, the clocks are not synchronous. And hence, you don't get TA equal to TB. You get a difference between TA and TB. And that is given in this case. So it depends on V and X. So local time, using local time, you could explain negative ether drift results only to the first order in V by C. But if you had a V by C square, the local time business failed. And that was needed because much better experiments started coming. So as a mathematical tool, Lorentz brought out the Lorentz transformation in 1899. And whether you believe it or not, they are used even today. I'll show you right now. Lorentz attempted a theory that all molecular forces affected by Lorentz transformation as electrostatic forces. And Lorentz attempted to create a theory in which relative motion of earth and ether is undetectable. So this is the generalized contraction hypothesis. Forces between electrons and electrons themselves contracted along the direction of motion. This is also interesting. If this pencil is moving this way, the length will come down. But this width or this dimensions will not change. The pencil moves like this, it will become flatter this way, but nothing will happen to this way. The change is only in the direction of motion. So if it is moving like this, only this aspect will change. So if it is moving like this, it will seem to be like this. So Max Abraham, a German scientist, physicist at that time, noted a difference. This electron configuration, if you contract it, it becomes unstable. So you have to have a non-electromagnetic force to stabilize, which is very difficult to understand. And this is our Max Abraham. So here are the Lorentz transformations. So T is so when I'm using a dash, that is the moving frame. When it is fixed, no dash, it is the non-moving frame. So you see T prime is equal to T minus Vx by C square divided by 1 minus V square by C. So the interesting thing is this lower one. 1 minus V square by C square is popping up everywhere. Okay. These are called the direct transformations, these are called the reverse transformations. And so you see, if V is much, much less than C, these things become very different. They start looking very different. These equations become important only when V is close to C, at least say 20% of C. And here at the bottom, I don't know how to show you. At the bottom, we have the Galilean transformation. So I'll show you something interesting. X prime is equal to, or X is equal to X prime plus Vt divided by something. You make V very small compared to C, so the denominator becomes 1. You can ignore it. So X will become equal to X prime plus Vt. And here, if you make V is very small compared to C, this will become 1, this will become 0. So T will be equal to T prime. So theory of relativity comes smoothly into Newtonian mechanics or Galilean mechanics when velocities are very, very small. And by small, you can include the fastest aeroplanes that are moving even today. So now let me introduce you to this gentleman. Albert Einstein comes in the picture only in 1905. He wrote this German paper in Annalen der Physik, which came out in 1905. And mind you, he was just an engineer from a not so good institute of Germany, working as a clerk in a Swiss patent office. He wrote this, he wrote 5 papers that year. And we are looking at one which is for us the most important, but not the most important at that time, on the electrodynamics of moving bodies. The English version, which we mostly read, is by somebody we know very well, that is Magnus. So he showed that Newtonian mechanics or Galilean transformation are incompatible with Maxwell's electromagnetism. From the experimental side, Michelson-Morley null result, stellar aberration, and many similar experiments. So it was shown that hypothetical ether did not exist. So the experiments had shown it. The fact that Maxwell's electromagnetism was not playing fair with Newtonian mechanics also showed it. But here comes the result on the electrodynamics of moving bodies. And this is what Einstein looked like when he published those papers. He was barely 25. So from here, Einstein develops special relativity, which corrects mechanics to handle situations involving all motions and especially those at a speed close to that of light. These are called relativistic velocities. And right now, the special relativity, see, appears as the most accurate model of motion. It fails when you go for very small objects. But that is another story, which again starts with something. Again, Einstein has a piece in that cake, has a share of that pie, but here he has the whole pie to himself, where he has a very small share. That is quantum mechanics. So let us now develop Einstein's relativity as it should be done from the basics. So now, whenever you have to develop a theory, you have to start with some assumptions. And we say that the lesser the number of assumptions, the more robust is your theory. Theory of relativity starts from only 2 such things, which are called postulates. There are only 2 postulates. The first postulate says that the laws of physics are invariant in all inertial frames of reference. That is, in any frames of reference which have no acceleration, the laws of physics are same. That does not mean the values would be same. The laws are same. The speed of light in vacuum, is the same for all observers. Whether you are in a moving frame, whether you are in a static frame, from any frame, if you measure the speed of light in vacuum, it is the same. It will always remain the same. These are the 2 basic postulates of special theory of relativity. Let us try to understand the 2. Just wanted to see how far I have done more than that. So let us look at the postulates in slightly more details. A given inertial frame is no better than another inertial frame. They are same. There is no preferred reference frame. You cannot say that reference frame with me in this house is preferred to the one with you in your moving car. They are all same. So which means that I cannot say whether I'm moving or I'm not moving. There is no way I can find it. I can only say that I'm moving with respect to you or I'm not moving with respect to you. Here is the relativity. If you are moving with respect to me, I'm moving with respect to you. There is no absolute inertial frame. There is no absolute rest frame as it was said with the ether. So here there is an interesting connection I saw with Gulliver's Travels. So probably as literature people you will appreciate more. Gulliver's Travels say that Gulliver saw the people of Lilliput were very small for Gulliver. So for the Lilliput people, Gulliver was a giant. That is not relativity. Our kind of relativity is, to me you should look like a giant, and to you I should look like a giant. That's what is going to happen. So this is very counterintuitive from what you see in Gulliver's. This is where the relativity comes from. There is no absolute inertial flow. If the laws of physics hold in one inertial frame, which I see that they hold in the frame in which I am sitting, then they will hold in your frame. If there are two frames, S and S prime, S should see things in S prime in exactly the same way as S prime sees things in S. We can switch the labels of S and S prime. Gulliver and Lilliput, we cannot switch the labels. We cannot switch the labels. Gulliver sees the Lilliput as small, Lilliput sees Gulliver as large. If I interchange, the whole story goes wrong. But here it will not go wrong, which means if Gulliver sees the Lilliput as small, Lilliput should see Gulliver as small. And there are two more points. Empty space is homogeneous. All points are same. You can start the zero at any point. Empty space is isotropic. All directions are same. So we can choose anything as the answer. Now comes the second postulate. It is not obvious. It is not even easy to believe. It is easy to understand, but it seems too silly to be true. Like we have all experienced this. If I throw something from a moving train, it goes really fast if I throw it forward. And if I throw it backwards, it goes really slow. We all know that. Throwing tomatoes from cars or throwing tomatoes from moving trucks is a regular game during Holi. So, but that is not true for light. If I am moving in a train, I switch a light, okay, it will reach the fellow in front at the same time as it will reach the fellow at the back in the same distance. But that is not true for a ball. The ball speed is different at different speeds because the speed is not the speed of light. The speed of light is constant. This cannot be demonstrated from first principles, obviously, because it's an assumption. You have to rely on experiment. Many experiments have been done to measure the speed of light postulate. And in the last 100 years, plenty, means innumerable experiments have been. One of the best known, of course, was the Michelson and Morley experiment, which was later done using lasers. And now it is being done in other ways. Even the time measurements have become very accurate. It has been found that the speed of light in vacuum is c and is constant everywhere. Now comes another interesting thing. If two things happen simultaneously to me, do they also happen simultaneously to you, or they don't? This is the question. Okay. Two things occur simultaneously to me in one frame of reference. You are in another frame of reference. Do they happen exactly the same way to you? That's what we will see. It does not. What is simultaneous to me is not simultaneous to you. What is simultaneous to you is not simultaneous. If you read the book Mr. Tompkins, The New World of Mr. Tompkins, this has been explained very beautifully. Now see, there is a train. This is the reference frame A, in which there is Mr. A is sitting here. A light has been flashed, and the light has been flashed, and the light is going in both directions. This is bang in the center. So is it reaching here and here at the same time? For A, yes. For Mr. B, who is moving in this direction at a velocity v, at a speed v, is it the same? Let us see. This length of the coach is 2L, length of this object. So at the center, when you see the light, to reach here is L by C, to reach here is L by C. Same time. So switch on the light and this end and this end detect the light at this end. So if you take it as two events, light hits left end, light hits right end, the two events occur together. Now this observer B is moving in this direction at a speed v. Let us interchange. Let us make this vehicle start moving at a speed v in the right direction. Now what happens is TL and TR will become different. Because from his point of view, this speed and this speed are different. but that is not possible. We saw that. So what happens? See, light starts from here at time t equal to 0. By the time light reaches here, this whole object has moved. This whole object has moved. By how much? By v times t. So it is your L prime is changing. Your L prime, this side and L prime this side are not same. So you will see that TL and TR, TL is L prime by C plus V, TR is L prime by C minus V. So there is a change. So what was simultaneous for Mr. A is not simultaneous for Mr. B. And here is another interesting thing. Let us say a train is moving, okay? There's a train moving here, okay? At the front there is a clock, at the back there is a clock, okay? In the train frame, they are showing the same time, okay? In the train frame, they are showing the same time. Okay? But what will happen from the ground frame? The train is traveling at a speed v. If we observe from ground frame, the two clocks will not show the same time. The two clocks will not show the same time simultaneously. There is a non-zero difference in the time of the two clocks. So the same clocks, okay, you are seeing on the train, I am seeing from outside the train. You will say they are correct, both are giving the same time. I will say no, the back clock is slightly ahead of the front. You will not be able to measure it with an ordinary train, okay? With a normal train, you will not be able to do it. Your fictitious train has to move very, very fast. So, a special case, let us say, in the ground frame, the rear and front clocks read 12:01 and 12:00. The back clock says it is 12:01 and the front clock says 12. Okay. At that time, you shoot at both the clocks, okay, and they stop. Can we do that? You shoot them and they stop. Okay. So you will say both have been shot together from the ground frame. The gentleman in the train frame will say this clock was hit at 12, this clock was hit at 12:01. So what is simultaneous in the ground frame is not simultaneous in the train. So this is like this. This is how the train is moving. So LC minus V, LC plus V, 2 by 2C. And here you see the front clock is reading 0. The back clock is reading LV by C, where L is the length of the train. So this is called time dilation. A moving clock runs slightly slow. So the time measured in the moving clock is TB is equal to TA by 1 minus V square by 6. And if you see, as your V increases, so when V is 1, if V is C, if V by C is 1, T prime is infinity, which is T by 0. So you can't divide by 0, so it goes to infinity. But when T prime by T is, this is here you are measuring T prime by T. If your velocity is 0.1, 10% of the speed of light, you don't see any difference. Only from 30% you are starting to see a difference. So if your speed is less than 30% of the speed of light, you don't see it. So this is another take home that time is dilated. A moving clock runs slow as seen by an observer at rest. So let us say V by C is equal to 3 by 5. Then gamma, which is this whole quantity, 1 by 1 minus V square by C square is 5 by 4. So A is standing at rest on train next to a light source and B is standing on ground. Now A starts clapping his hands at 4-second intervals. Okay? Every 4 seconds he claps according to his watch. B takes his watch and measures. He will get it as 5 seconds. If you are doing it 4 seconds on the train, it will become 5 seconds on the ground. But you see, your speed has to be very, very 3 by 4. So This brings in a concept of space time. We knew that there is space. This is space all around me. This is the one axis, this is one axis, this is one. Right? Beautiful spaces. There is time, which I measure with the clock. No. Relativity says there is nothing called space, there is nothing called time. They have got mixed up now. We have only one thing called space time. So if you see here, time is involving space, x is here, and x is involving time. So we talk not about space and time, we speak about space time. We will not talk about space and time anymore. In relativity, it is always space time. Now, the idea of velocity addition is also complicated. As they say, for a bullet, a train, and a gun, adding the speeds can be fun. You just add the two speeds. Take a trip down the path paved with Einstein's new math, where half plus half isn't one. So the velocity goes like that. V is not equal to u plus v. It is equal to u plus v by 1 plus uv by c. Again, if your u and v are small, it is still v is equal to u. Mass also changes. The mass of a moving body increases according to this equation. And then let's come to the final thing. Mass and energy are the same? Yes, mass and energy are same. Mass can be converted to energy. Energy could be converted to mass. The equation is like that. E square is equal to P square C square plus M square C4. What does it mean? What is this P? P is the momentum, mass into velocity. So E square is P square C square plus M square C4. This is the equation, okay? Now, if you take a photon, the light particles, M is 0, so E is equal to PC. No problem. For a body at rest, if the body is not moving, P is equal to 0. No momentum, so E is equal to MC square, our good friend. Now, how big can MC square be? Actually, it is very, very big because C is huge, right? C is really, really, really huge. So, let us take a case, okay, to get some idea about how big it is. Let M be equal to 1 kilo. 1 kilo is not a lot of mass, right? Then MC square becomes equal to 1 kg into 3 into 10 to the power 8 meter per second square. That gives me 10 to the power 17 joule. So if you take a typical household electric bill, this must be from America, our electric bills are less. It is 10 to the power 4 units per year, which gives you 3.6 into 10 power 10 joule per year. So you are using 10 power 10 joule in a year. You are getting 10 power 17 joule. So roughly you can give electricity to 3 million homes for a full year by converting 1 kilo of stuff. Okay? By converting 1 kilo of mass into pure energy, you can provide enough electricity to 3 million, that is 30 lakh houses for a full year. And this is going by American standards. Our electric bills are much. So this thing is done in the nuclear reactor. But nuclear reactors, you convert a very small fraction of mass into usable energy. Rest of the mass remains in the final products, which are thrown and become an environmental hazard. But even a small fraction, even if it is 1%, even if it is 1% of 1 kilo, then also you can do 30,000 homes for a year. It's still very large. And the use of nuclear power and the use of nuclear weapons show that it can be very, very large because C is such a huge number and it is coming as a square. Nuclear fission, there are many good and bad stories. Discovered in December 1838 by physicists Lise Meitner and Otto Robert Fish. Lise Meitner, Otto Robert Fish, and Lise Meitner was the aunt of Otto Robert Fish, and the chemists were Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. So the I'll show you a picture. And there's a nucleus of a large atom. You break it into two or more small nuclei, lighter nuclei. It gives a large, it produces gamma rays and releases a large amount of energy. That energy is captured in the form of heat energy used to make steam. With that steam, you generate electricity. This is the controlled reaction where you use it as energy. The uncontrolled energy is the nuclear. So here it is. Here is our uranium 230. You hit it with a neutron, with a slow neutron. So it becomes 236 uranium, and this breaks into two. The example given here is barium and krypton. It can be any two. What is this and what is this is none of our business. But it gives off a lot of energy in the form of heat, in the form of their, because these are moving, so they also carry energy. And it gives me three fast neutrons. And these fast neutrons are very fast, which if they which have to be now. Now your job is, now is the trick. You have to slow these fellows down to this speed and then hit another uranium. And this is how the chain reaction starts. So nuclear reactors all are working on using energy released by nuclear fission. This is fission, one big one breaking into two. Fission occurs by uranium atoms by hitting it with a slow neutron, but you can do it only with uranium 230, not uranium 238. Now the problem is you have only 0.7% of uranium 235. Rest of it is uranium 238. Uranium 238 will absorb the neutron and stay there. Nothing will happen. So this is what will give you the energy. So you have to be able to hit the uranium 235, break it into two, release the neutrons, slow them down, and hit them back again. So since uranium 235 is only 0.7%, so you cannot have a self-sustaining chain reaction easily with it. So you have to enrich the uranium to 4%. If you have 4%, then that is enough. So they will break at a rate so that enough extra neutrons will be coming up. You have to slow them down, remove some of them, and send the rest of them back to the reactor. So this will go on and on and on. The object will become hot. Heat will be removed using some coolant, cooling agency. It can be water or it can be liquid metal. Now, if it is water, you will directly get steam. If it is liquid metal, with the liquid metal, you have to make steam. With the steam, you will run a power plant, which will give you electricity. In case of the bombs, you have to get something like 90% of uranium 235, and you have to hit it with a neutron, and that's it. It's a tremendous explosion, and it will be uncontrolled. Okay, so this is the biggest thing which made uranium fission important and theory of relativity known to everybody. It became important. But is this the only use of relativity? I did ask you a question at the beginning, right? What is common to the color of gold, the liquidness of mercury, GPS systems, etc. Let us look at them now. So the GPS systems were built, I believe, in the 1990s, early 90s, at a cost of $10 billion for military navigation. But it is not, it has nothing to do with military navigation anymore. Of course, it is there for military navigation, but that's not the main thing anymore. It has become a thriving commercial industry. You and I also use it, our mobiles. So there are 24 satellites which are orbiting the Earth, and they orbit the Earth twice a day. They orbit the Earth twice a day. And a handheld GPS, your receiver, can detect radio emissions from the satellites which are above the ground level. So normally any four would be there. So the time signals from these four, based on the time signal of these four, your device determines your latitude, your longitude, and your altitude. And the accuracy nowadays is around 15 meters. So you end up in the next house sometimes, or in the next street. So be careful. When you are very close to your destination, start using your brain on your own. Don't trust the GPS when you are very close to your destination. And the time has to be accurate to 50 nanoseconds. Nano is 10 to the power minus 9. So it is 50 divided by 1 with 9 zeros. The GPS is used in airplane navigation, oil exploration, wilderness recreation, bridge construction, sailing, truck movement, and right now in Ola and Uber. Here it is how it is. Here are your four satellites, and they are all sending you this is the one distance. These are four distances have to be calculated, and these two have to be synchronized. Based on that, you will get longitude, latitude, altitude, and now, what the hell to do with relativity? There is nothing to do with relativity. No, there is a lot to do with relativity. What is it? The satellite clocks are going around the Earth twice. And the speed is 14,000 kilometers per hour. So 14,000 kilometers per hour, not much, right? But sufficient to make your clock run slower by 7 microseconds. That is 0.00000007 seconds per day. Okay, but that is not the main thing. Here, actually, general relativity also comes in, which we have not studied. They are 20,000 kilometers above Earth, okay, up there, very, very high. So since they are 20,000 kilometers above the Earth, they experience not the gravity we get here, but 1/4 of the gravity. And that makes the clock tick faster. And that faster is 45 microseconds per day. So 45 minus this 7 will give you 38 microseconds in a day error. And that is enough to put all your results go crazy. So the GPS has to correct for this. This 38 microseconds a day has to be corrected. And this correction is done using mathematical models. And then only you can get the correct value and know where you are standing. Otherwise, if this is not corrected, I'm in Calcutta now, but my GPS may end up saying I'm in Bombay if the error goes on for a year. Now, gold. Of course, we all know the color of gold. It's a beautiful mellow yellow color of gold. Why is it so? If you notice, none of the other metals have this color. No other metal has a natural golden color. All of them are either dark like lead or iron, or they are shining white like silver, tin, aluminium, nickel, like that. The only metal which has this mellow golden color, mellow yellow color is gold. Well, gold has an atomic number of 79. It is in the last row of stable elements, sixth period of the periodic table. There are only 4 elements which are more stable, which are having atomic number higher than gold. That is mercury, helium, lead, and bismuth. Now, 79 protons means the electrons face a lot of electrostatic attraction. So if you go old-fashioned, okay, go by the Bohr model of the atom, the electron has to move at 1.6 into 10 to the power 8 meter per second. Otherwise, it will fall into the nucleus. Okay? So it will not be stable. To be stable, it has to move at this speed. This speed is almost c by 2. So the electron mass goes up 20%. Okay, and this happens in a big way to the s electrons, not so much to the p, d, f, and g orbitals, unless. Now, what happens is the 6 s orbitals become smaller, whereas the 5d orbitals remain the same. So the energy difference between, not 5d, 4d, between 4d and 6s becomes less. Becomes less means it can absorb with blue light, it can absorb blue light, and an electron from the 4d can jump into 6s. Okay, so it starts absorbing blue light. That is, blue, indigo, and violet start getting absorbed. So what is left to reflect? It is VIB is left, GYOR are there. So green, yellow, orange, and red are reflected, and probably a slight amount of blue. So that is what gives us this yellowish hue, which we call gold. So this is the reason. And if you see, this is the size of the s orbital. For gold, it becomes very, very small. For Mercury, it is slightly more. So after that, it increases a bit. And this side, these are not stable, so we're not worried about it. So this is an effect of general rhythm, of special relativity. Why is Mercury a liquid? We have seen Mercury as a liquid, right? And it has a very funny properties also, which we all know. So Mercury is a liquid because it has two electrons in the sixth shell. So, and these electrons are tightly bonded to the nucleus. So they don't interact with the next. So Mercury bonds are very, very weak. And so to form a solid, they have to be close and they should bond with each other. That's when the crystal will be formed. So that energy, the energy to do that is very small. So room temperature heat gives enough energy to break out of it. And that is why Mercury is a solid at room, is a liquid at room temperature. Not only it is a liquid at room temperature, it is a liquid till minus 39 degrees. So for a doctor, doesn't matter. A doctor can do all his expert work using mercury thermometer. And we as kids, we were all our fevers when we were kids were measured by the mercury in glass. The lead acid battery, which was the powerhouse of all our cars, motorcycles later, but cars, buses, trucks, everything is to run on lead acid battery. Why does it work at only for lead? The element right on top of lead in the periodic table is tin. But have you heard of a tin battery? No. There are no tin acid batteries. It doesn't work. This is again because of the relativistic effects. Here it is 82. It is gold, then it is mercury, then there is thallium, and then there is lead. So here the speed of the fast electrons comes out to be 0.60. So these electrons are heavy. And this excite battery, as you are seeing it, is not the first one, many have been known. The anode is made of lead oxide and the cathode is made of lead. And the electrolyte is sulfuric acid. So relativistic effects are more from the lead oxide. So the potential wells into which the electrons can be accommodated become stronger. So more electrons are pulled towards it. And in lead, the increase in the effective mass makes the electrons come closer to the nucleus, which is not wanted. So lead is not a very good cathode, but lead oxide is a very good anode, very, very good anode. And that's what makes this fellow very successful. And you see, this lady is trying to start her car with a handle, and our old man is coming with a battery. And there is, you can see E equal to mc square. So to conclude from here, we have almost reached the conclusion now. Special relativity spot a paradigm shift in our understanding of the nature of the universe. Fundamental fabric till then were space, here, time, here, two different. They were considered as something independent of each other. Newton has written a lot of it. But special relativity now comes, takes them together, and bunches them in such a way that you cannot separate each other. The old intuitive view that space and time are independent is gone. Relativity of simultaneity. If you say those two things occurred together, I will say no, they did not. That is very funny. More than that, you say A occurred, then B occurred. I will say no, B occurred and then A occurred. Even that is simultaneity is done for. That is another thing. Then comes the final story that nothing can move faster than light. The speed of light is the upper limit of all speeds. So the applications are there in the nuclear energy, the bomb, the GPS, gold, mercury, lead. These are the applications. So we want to know Einstein in a slightly interesting way. So here is one story. Einstein and one of his assistants have written a paper and want a clip to fix it. There was a clip, but it was very badly bent, cannot be used. So how to straighten it? They were looking for something, and they found a whole box of clips. Now what do you do? You take one clip, fix the paper, and done. No, he used one of the clips, changed its shape, and then used it to correct the bent clip. So, as Einstein said, once I'm set on a goal, it becomes difficult to deflect. And he said later on in Princeton that this, if you can describe me in one anecdote, this is the best. So there is another story that one colleague asked him for his phone number, so he pulled up a telephone directory and found it and gave him. And when he asked, "Why don't you remember?" He said, "Why should I memorize my own phone number? I can get it from the book." So Einstein never memorized anything which could be looked up in less than 2 minutes. So with this, I finished my part of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And whatever questions are there, I think Dr. Banerjee would be coordinating them, and I'll try to answer them.
Thank you so much, sir, for uh, for a very interesting and captivating lecture on a topic which we have long forgotten. Thank you for bringing back the memories of school once again and making us nostalgic. It's a very complicated topic, though, and we thoroughly enjoyed uh, this interesting talk and the anecdotes. And what was most interesting was the Gulliver's Travel example which you gave, uh, which was very interesting. So thank you, sir, on behalf of Team Dart Voyage for taking the pain and taking out your time and preparing so many slides and presenting it in a very lucid and very concrete manner, in a very synchronous way. So thank you very much, sir. And if you please allow me, I'll put forward few questions.
Okay, okay.
The first question is, how did we get from knowing about nothing to knowing things like the size of an electron? Do you think we are unique in this universe? Could you please explain the space-time curve to us? How did Einstein deduce it?
Okay, this is where we land in trouble to understand. These are things which are not very clearly understood yet. Yes, the size of the electron has been estimated using many techniques. And actually, relativity does not come in the picture there at all. Because that is actually a success of quantum mechanics. If you would ask me that question, it's a success of quantum mechanics. So which is still a developing field. So if you want to really look at this from where he started, it seems the starting point was this: you are going in a boat. The boat is moving. You see the you see waves generated from the boat moving in the two directions. If the boat is going slowly, you see the waves moving forward, backward, sideways. But for a motorboat, you don't see the waves moving forward. This is a close example where the boat, there is a maximum speed possible for the waves. And the waves coming out of the boat, be it any frame of reference, cannot go faster than that. This is what prompted Einstein to bring in the concept that the speed of light is constant and it is an upper limit. But actually, that is not totally true because Einstein had something behind it. Maxwell's calculation very clearly showed that if electricity and magnetism intertwine themselves to form a kind of wave. They can only move at one speed, and that is precisely the speed of light. So that the speed of light is special and different from the speed of that truck or that bus or that train was known even then. And as far as coming from the concept of nothing to the size of the electron, I don't know how to look at it.
Thank you, sir. I uh, I have a curiosity, and this is the best time I think I can put it across. Uh, as someone who has spent his entire life on physics, what is that aspect of physics which you feel is the guiding force of you being drawn into this particular field and carrying on with such extensive study and researching and going abroad also and doing a lot of work in your postdoc and coming back, because you did your engineering from a very reputed institute, and at that age people can get easily lured by the offers and everything that one gets. So what is that aspect of physics which drove you so far?
Okay, the first I have to correct you that my studies in IIT Kanpur was not engineering. I am a MSc in physics from there. So engineering was never an interest to me actually from a very young age.
I stand corrected. Sorry for that. But
So
same,
then yes,
you have done your
what you are
studies
saying
from a
is
very
in a
premier
way
institute.
correct. What you are saying is in a way correct. There was a huge and very lucrative opening at that time for the typical science person. That was the new, newly opened software industry. But yes, it was the fundamental interest in physics. The idea of getting something new. And if you are working in a lab, you will realize that when you suddenly get results, how different you feel. And probably that's what we live for. We don't live for the salary or the money or anything. We live for you're doing your experiments and suddenly the results start coming. And you see the results are different from what you had expected. Or the results are same as what you are expecting. Or you are getting no result. In any case, it's a result. Like I pointed out today itself, the biggest failure which changed physics, the Michelson-Morley experiment. It is considered to be the most important failure in the history of sciences. They could not get any results, and that's the obsession that kept them working on it for more than 10 years. So it was more of, I would say it's more in the fundamental interest of the subject.
No, what you said is something very very interesting, and that is uh, people like y'all are into it because of this new inventions in the form of test results that you'll get. I can understand, because I also have a scientist at home, so I understand the importance of results, and how depressing or how interesting and how happy and how sad your mood can fluctuate with the results. And yes, so that is the beauty of science. And somehow we are from a different field, we are having someone from a different field, and this is an interaction which is very interesting. And uh, I can just say that uh, the way you put across uh, your uh, your presentation about Einstein's idea of relativity is the basic motto of this lecture series, where when we prepared, when we were in planning stage, our main intention was to inculcate those ideas, basic ideas, which has gone in the last 400-500 years, and which has played a very very significant role in humankind, in mankind. And you have it goes without saying, you have truly justified the objective of this particular topic with which it was put there. It was introduced. We very well knew that this is something which is not our forte. In fact, tomorrow's topic is also very challenging. And but these are the ideas which changed, mankind, irrespective of their genre, irrespective of their field of study. That is what we felt. And thank you very much, sir, for taking out your time and coming on this podium, on this platform, and truly justifying our cause, with which our intention with which this particular 15 days lecture series is planned, is formulated. You have done, you have totally justified it. And thank you very much. I would just require if Basudhara, my co-organizer.
Amitabh sir, to listen to you. And I believe that for ages, we have not heard this wonderful blending of science and poetry. So what you did today for us this evening, you kind of uncovered the secrets of science in a very poetic way before us. And I was following, the way you spoke and the way you tried all the time to bring us back to the central idea of ideas. So we are very grateful to you for, I mean, honestly feel that had I heard someone like this before you, I might have been more interested in science. So the credit goes to you for making all us literature lovers today deeply engrossed in science. We are indebted to you for the time that you have spent with us, for the efforts that you have made to enrich us. And we hope that we will be able to listen to you very soon again. Thank you so much from that voyage and from each of us here today.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
So humble of you, sir.
It was a new and challenging task for me, and I hope I have done some justice to whatever you wanted from me. And
absolute justice. We are
able
to.
Any more questions? You can pass them on to me.
Science better, and we are able to forge the relationships between ideas better through your tracing of these patterns. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And participants, tomorrow we meet again with, we come back again with a very interesting idea, that is Darwin's Origin of Species. And we are happy that tomorrow our spokesperson again will be a very, very erudite and learned scholar, Dr. Shreya Bhattacharjee. So please be on time at 6 o'clock. Thank you so much. Please take care. Good night. Thank you so much.